and welcome to this episode of Counsel Trends. I am Dr. Mercy Connors, and this is Dr. Shannae Anderson, and we are really excited about our topic today. So this is an older article. This is from 2017, but we really thought that this was very important because human flourishing has been widely talked about lately in the literature.
It is trending.
It is trending. Hence Counsel Trends. But we wanted to go back to the original one so that you could get a really good basis as to why this is important. So our article is On the Promotion of Human Flourishing by Tyler Vanderweel. And this was from June 16th, 2017, and you will be able to see this article in the comments below. But I think it's very interesting. We should start out with a definition. So what the World Health Organization defines as health, just general health, is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, which I find very, very interesting that we're bringing in these other aspects of health that not always do we think about as health, like mental health, but social health as well. I find that very, very interesting that they're bringing that out. But one of the things that was talking about human flourishing is this whole positive affect state. So not just a feeling or a movement, but it's a state of being that this human flourishing is. And then it goes into that not only is it positive affect, but it's psychological well-being. So that can correlate to life satisfaction, meaning, purpose, autonomy, self-acceptance, optimism, positive relationship, mastery, self-determination, resilience, personal growth, vitality, engagement, and self-esteem. So just reading all of that, I'm kind of tired just thinking about all of that. Like, that's what it takes to be flourishing.
Right. Well, and I keep thinking how it even speaks early on that major psychological studies focus only on the alleviation of symptoms.
Yes, and we've talked a little bit about this in Counsel Trends, how we don't really talk about health, mental health. We talk a lot about mental illness and the alleviation of the illness.
And that's where I love flourishing, because that is not only the absence of mental illness, and even more than I think just mental health, it is actually flourishing. And as we get through the article, we're going to talk about how to measure that, what that looks like. I think it's a very exciting field.
I find it very interesting. And then it also talks about how in the literature, Vanderweel struggled to find certain aspects in psychological literature, which I thought was interesting. So the ones that he had a hard time finding longitudinal studies for were prudence or practical wisdom, justice, fortitude or courage, and temperance or moderation, which kind of makes sense because I feel like those are more like spiritual in a lot of ways.
Well, and that's where he touches on that those are actually called the 4 fundamental virtues. And nobody talks about virtues anymore. Nobody talks about integrity and how these are more of, I think, a philosophical perspective and looking at what makes one a virtuous person. So we know, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, we had the aesthetics that would talk about virtues and things like that. But how nowadays it's so hedonistic that it's about, you know what, you do you, and whatever feels good, do it. But nobody looks at characters and, some of these things like virtues, like you said, prudence, wisdom, justice, fortitude, courage, temperance. Nobody considers these things anymore.
And why do you think that is? Do you think that's just because people think that we have moved beyond these virtues, or has it been really a destruction of truth and what truth is?
I think it's that. I think you remove God from the public square, you remove God from school, you remove God from the culture, and it's really, whatever I want, as opposed to that there is this higher standard. of true integrity and character. Because think about it, that's not an issue that you really hear much about anymore.
Right. The character of an individual. It's more
Exactly.
about what he does or she does. It's
Or
not
how someone looks or how they feel.
Yes.
All
yes.
these, in some ways, like superficial qualities.
Very much so. And I wonder too if that's what he's going back to. So when Vanderweel moves forward as to what are the pathways to human flourishing, he finds 4 different pathways, which I find extremely interesting.
Yes.
They are family, work, education, and religious community. And these 4 pathways then go into 5 different domains. So think of them as like a kind of a, well, here, I'll show you a picture of it. So these 4 pathways go into 5 different domains that give you human flourishing. And those are happiness and life satisfaction, physical and mental health, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, and close social relationships. Now, it's very interesting to me because when I was reading through this, he was giving his reasoning for all of this, and it made complete sense.
Right.
And I was like, well, yes, we know those things. He put it in a way that you could actually now really look at somebody and say, okay, are they really flourishing or not? Do they have all of these aspects?
I think it's a really amazing model of really listing the 5 components of flourishing.
Yeah.
I mean, if we could just talk about that for a moment.
Sure.
That if you're flourishing, you're going to have happiness and life satisfaction.
Right.
You'll have physical and mental health. You'll have meaning and purpose, which think about that. If you're just talking about mental health, a lot of times meaning and purpose is not even discussed.
Right. No.
Which are more kind of existential concerns.
Right.
But also, again, I love this, character and virtue.
And those 2 things, meaning and purpose and character and virtue, really go back to identity. And we talk a lot about identity in the negative sense, but not in the positive sense of this is how you know who you are and how you're going to make decisions, not only currently, but in the future.
And this is why, again, I think it goes back to the fact that we are a post-Christian population now, that we don't care really about meaning and purpose, although we can get into that in a moment. I think that's really one of the big problems nowadays.
Sure.
But character and virtue are so important. And then lastly, close social relationships. So those 5 different factors make up human flourishing.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because I would say that mental health in general really focuses on close social relationships.
Yes.
Physical and mental health, right? And happiness and life satisfaction, but they're missing 2 very important areas.
Exactly.
Where there could be a lot of, and even in this character and virtue, the idea that just came to me was discipleship. How important that is. And even in mental health, we do a lot of that discipleship. It's creating within that person the ideas that is going to substantiate what they do later on in life.
That's very true. I thought it was interesting in the article, and I'm kind of hijacking it a little for a moment, when they were looking at the 5 different areas that you can have somebody that maybe has a lot of happiness and life satisfaction. They may have great physical and mental health. They may actually believe their meaning and purpose comes from, whoever has the most toys wins. And they may have close friendships, and they may actually believe that they're flourishing. But without character and virtue, are they really? And the example he used in there is like somebody, let's say, who is a drug addict or an alcoholic or somebody who is really engaged in a highly hedonistic lifestyle. They may think that they're doing well, but objectively, if you don't have character and virtue, can you say that they're flourishing? Do you know? So it's like a lot of people, I think, might say they have a lot of mental health, even though they're engaging in what things I would arguably say are destructive because they lack character and virtue. So you can't really say that they're flourishing.
Right.
That I think those things are so critical to add for that flourishing component.
But he's also saying that you also need the 4 pathways. You do need family. You do need work. You do need education. And he says you do need religious community.
Exactly.
Which I find very, very interesting that when I read the last part about the religious community, it was not self-spiritual. It was not the spiritual disciplines. It was connecting with others.
And that actually, what I love about the model is each one of those 4 areas predict each of the 5 levels of flourishing. And he actually cites research that backs up each pathway.
Yes.
And that's what I love about it, is that family will impact all 5 forms of flourishing. Work will impact all 5, and so on and so on. But I was really not surprised, but thrilled to see his incorporation of religious community and how it directly impacts flourishing in so many great ways.
Well, what I was excited about was that there was enough research on religious communities to show that this really was an impact and that it impacted in like you said, so many different ways, but there was significant amount of information that showed that. And I found it very, very interesting too. I'll take family as an example. He talked about marriage, and I thought that was very, very interesting because, marriage today, there's a lot of our young people are like, I'm never going to get married, or they're upset because there's lots of divorces and things like that. But he went through and gave you all of these like positives for marriage, which I was like, woo, that was amazing to see, and it hit every one of these areas. So, for example, marriage is associated with higher life satisfaction, greater affective happiness, evidence for marriage associated with better mental health, physical health, longevity, and even controlling for baseline health issues. Then it also shows that marriage is helpful for a higher level of personal growth and reduction of crime. Also, higher levels of meaning and purpose in life, higher levels of positive relationship with others, higher levels of perceived social support, and lower levels of loneliness, better financial outcomes, even controlling for baseline financial status and education. But then he showed the converse. He showed the opposite. He showed that divorce is associated with poorer mental and physical health outcomes, even controlling for baseline health, lower levels of happiness and life satisfaction, lower levels of meaning and purpose in life, lower levels of positive relationships with others, poor relationships between children and parents, and greater levels of poverty for both children and mothers. So then he goes on to give you like, okay, in the area of family, what are some things that you can do? And one of the things that it talked about is even though sometimes a marriage seems very, very difficult, if you can work through those difficulties, it shows this positive trajectory that even though that marriage may be difficult, that within the difficulty, and again, that goes back to the resilience that he was talking about earlier, that you learn in that. And here are all the positive things in that learning, because we know that what we learn in family moves over into all these other areas.
Well, and that's where, again, I think it boils down to, if you want to flourish in life, have a family. Get married, have children. That if you don't have that, the likelihood of you flourishing decreases.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Same thing with work.
Yes.
If you don't have a job, and it even talked about if you move from being unemployed to employed, the positive factors that happen because now, your family is doing better, financially you're doing better, you have meaning and purpose. Like it goes through all of these different things.
But what was interesting when they were talking about the educational component is it really didn't talk about if you really enjoy your job or not. That it's really like if you're employed, that can lead to flourishing.
Yes.
That it doesn't, you don't have to have this job, because I work with so many patients that are saying, oh, I want my job to give me purpose. Well, that's only one component, because what we're recognizing is that there's other things that feed purpose and flourishing.
Well, and the thing is, too, is that ultimately that job is needed. So therefore there is a purpose, even though it may not be the purpose that you wish to fulfill, it is still a purpose that you are fulfilling. I think the other thing too is that we talk a lot about, especially in education and in work, this dream job.
Exactly.
Right. And those dream jobs do come around every so often, but oftentimes you have to work the really not fun jobs to get to those dream jobs. And I find that very interesting too, is that it's just Work just gives you that
Right.
that satisfaction in life. It also allows you to move forward.
Right.
And oftentimes does not. I know a lot of people think, oh, my job's keeping me back, but in all actuality, it's not. It's actually
Right.
helping you in human flourishing.
Well, and this is where I'm looking clinically at my patients.
Right.
And, they often have lots of conflict in their family. I have some, early 20s that they don't want to work.
Mm-hmm.
They just want to play,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't want to go back to school, and they're not involved in a religious community, and they're not flourishing, and they don't see it that way. What I think is so interesting is that as we look at these 4 different areas, I think people believe that they have to find joy in those areas to find flourishing. Does that make sense?
Yes.
That it's like, I have to have a happy family. I have to have the dream job.
Right.
I have to love school. I have to have all of these things that those in and of themselves are going to make me feel better. When it's a little bit more complicated, it's actually, if you get involved in these things all together, it creates flourishing.
Well, and I think that's why he calls it pathways, that they're not the end game.
Exactly.
These are the things to bring you to this, but you also have to realize that within those 4 areas is a lot of work. I mean, family is a lot of work. Work, obviously, by definition, is a lot of work. But education's a lot of work. And really, religious community is a lot of work. Not in the sense that being involved in a religious community, but I mean, speaking as a mother of young children, getting up on a Sunday morning is difficult.
Yes.
But when we do that, I see my family is much happier for the entire week.
Right.
They tend to enjoy that. They talk more about what they learned in Sunday school, and we have those community type aspects.
Which is interesting. It's taking me back. I'm going to go on a little detour for a second. It's taking me back to COVID.
Yes,
and the lockdowns,
I was thinking a lot about that.
And especially in California when everything was locked down and you couldn't actually physically go to church in California for some people for 2 years.
Right.
And I actually did a ton of research because I was fighting as a forensic psychologist to get the churches to reopen, because just watching church online is very different than actually being there amongst other people. And the research is showing, if you want flourishing, that is so important. That just sitting home and doing your own Bible study and maybe watching a service virtually is not going to ultimately yield the flourishing that you're seeking.
And I find it very interesting, too, that that's exactly how God designed it.
Yes.
God designed us to be in community. I was thinking about that verse, do not forsake the assembling of yourselves together. And the reason being is that God knew how this was supposed to work out. God knew what the meaning was. That's why he says, I hate divorce. Why do I hate divorce? Well, it has to go back to this. Do the work like an ant does. Work diligently. Why? Because it goes back to this. Deuteronomy 4-6, to teach your children as you go along the way. Why? Because education is important.
Exactly.
So, all of these things are very, very biblical.
Exactly.
But the things that don't necessarily come out in the Bible are what comes out of it. The happiness and life satisfaction. It's interesting because I think that sometimes we think that, spirituality and religiosity is very humdrum and it's very boring. But if you're seeing that this is what God intended, family, work, education, and religious community, you see this throughout the Psalms. You see this throughout the Proverbs. You see this throughout the Bible, that these things do. Now, does it say, hey, have a good family so that you can have good happiness, good life? It doesn't directly correlate.
But in some ways it does.
And sometimes
especially in Proverbs.
Yes, sometimes it does.
Right.
But not always.
Right.
And I think that too shows us that the Bible really is the manual
for human flourishing.
For human flourishing, and if we read it and really read
apply it.
Yes.
And get discipled in it.
But also I think don't gloss over the hard parts.
Right.
Because that's the other thing that this talks about is that it's not saying that family's always going to be easy. It's not saying that work is always going to be easy. But when you do the hard stuff, that's when God really works on you as an individual, and then these things come out of it.
Okay. So the last part of the article includes a measurement on flourishing. Did you do it?
I didn't do it.
Oh, well, then I'm going to you don't have to answer now
Okay.
because we didn't even talk about this before. But in the appendix of the article, they talk about flourishing measures. So if you want to get a copy of the article, you can assess, are you flourishing or not? And so it asks on a scale of 0, not satisfied at all, to 10 of being completely satisfied. The first domain it asks is happiness and life satisfaction. So overall, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole? You don't have to answer right now. But on a scale of 0 to 10, and then in general, how happy or unhappy do you usually feel? Do you want to do the second domain?
Okay, so the mental and physical health in general, how would you rate your physical health? 0 being poor, 10 being excellent. How would you rate your overall mental health? 0 being poor, 10 being excellent.
And then similarly, the third domain is meaning and purpose. And overall, to what extent do you feel the things you do in your life are worthwhile? 0 is not at all worthwhile. 10 is completely worthwhile. I understand my purpose in life. 0 is I strongly disagree. 10 is I strongly agree.
And then character and virtue, I always act to promote good in all circumstances, even in difficult and challenging situations. 0 is not true of me at all. And 10 is completely true of me. I am always able to give up some happiness now for the greater happiness later. Ooh, that's a good
That's
question.
maturity.
Yes.
Yep.
0, not true of me. 10, completely true of me.
And then lastly, the final domain is close social relationships. I am content with my friendships and relationships. 0 is strongly disagree. 10 is strongly agree. And my relationships are as satisfying as I would want them to be. 0, strongly disagree, and 10, strongly agree.
Now, they do have an extra
do you want to talk
domain,
about
and
that?
that's the financial and material stability.
Yeah.
So they did talk about how important that is to this flourishing piece, but there hasn't been a lot of research on that currently. So that's why he's just adding this in as another possible domain at this point. And that is, how often do you worry about being able to meet normal monthly living expenses? 0, worry all of the time, or 10, do not ever worry. And how often do you worry about safety, food, or housing? 0, worry all of the time, and 10, do not ever worry. So
Yeah, I think he recognizes that when you do have some financial and material stability, it's a lot easier to have flourishing.
Yes,
because
it does.
you're moving beyond the immediate concerns. But
Right.
how did you do you feel like you're flourishing? How did you score?
I
do
feel
you
like
think?
I did pretty good. I mean, I'm looking at this and I'm like, okay, most of this I would say are, 5s and above. But I mean, there are some things that I'm like, oh, I probably need to work on that a little bit.
I was pleasantly surprised, and again, I think because I'm so much older than you, that it's like I've seen how my flourishing has increased and grown throughout my life, especially finding meaning and purpose, and how relationships change so dramatically as you age. Like you've got 3 littles, and I'm an empty nester, and so I think it changes, and I think that would be an interesting study to look at how does human flourishing increase across time as you get older.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because I would say, if you would have asked me about human flourishing before I read this article, I would have said, no, I'm not flourishing because I'm tired all the time. And, I would have thought of more of like the external things.
Okay.
But when I read through, do I have meaning and purpose in my life, even though I am tired all the time, I have a lot of meaning and purpose because I'm working with these 3 little girls that I love so much.
And you're doing Counsel Trends.
And I'm doing Counsel Trends.
And helping so many people.
Yeah, but I think sometimes you think more of the external things and not of the internal things. And the internal things are the things that really produce the amount of life satisfaction. So
I think you're flourishing.
I think you're flourishing too.
And we hope that you're flourishing.
Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.